Okay, hi guys. We are going to continue with the argument building topic. You should have read the three pieces and you should have presented this in class, but we have to move to the online teaching thing. So I'll do like the three readings. I'm going to clarify how the authors build their arguments, how they specified their conceptual framework, and I'm going to leave perhaps the last one for you in order to review and submit in week 10 as it's listed in your syllabus. So we'll start with Ruschenmeier and Huber and Stephen's piece, Capitalist Development and Democracy. And you are going to see how they actually clarified the two concepts of capitalist development and democracy, and how they specified the causal forces in order to link between these two concepts. So here, as it appears in slide 3, they define democracy as a real voice in the collective decision-making of politics. So actually they focused mainly on the formal aspect of democracy, which is representative, the manifestation of the representative parliaments, in order to give subordinate classes or powerless people a share or a voice in the decision-making process. So that's why they try to delineate, this conception of formal democracy with other similar concepts like state responsiveness to citizen preferences and other kind of substantive notions of democracy. And they made it very clear in the beginning that they are going to focus on the formal aspect of democracy, and they specified like three main dimensions or criteria against which they can compare or classify different political regimes. So the first dimension is responsibility of the state before a representative parliament. The second dimension is regular and fair and free elections. And the third dimension is freedom of association and expression, and the extent of the universal or of the elections or the universal suffrage. So the first two dimensions actually they represented the essence of democratic governance, and the third one constitutes the exercise of democratic power. And along these dimensions, they can classify different regimes or to distinguish between democratic regimes and other regime types. They actually refer to three main political regimes: authoritarian, totalitarian, and constitutional or oligarchical ones. So the authoritarian regimes, these regimes are kind of rated 0 on the first two dimensions. So they don't have like responsibility, the state or the government is not responsible before a representative parliament, and they don't have regular, free, and fair elections. Totalitarian regimes, that they actually very low on the three, they actually rated very low on the three dimensions. So they don't have like any kind of responsibility of the government. They don't have like elections. They don't have like any guarantees of political and political rights like freedom of association and expressions. Constitutional or oligarchical regimes, they actually specify these regimes that they rank low on the inclusion part, like the extent of the suffrage, for example, that the elections are very limited to particular classes, like dominant classes, for example, and the state is fairly responsible before the parliament, and there is kind of a legal framework in order to safeguard the political liberties, more or less. So they specified clearly what they mean by democracy, and they focus mainly on the formal element of democratic governance, and they differentiate between democratic regimes and other types of democratic regimes, that they might share some of their features, of the democratic features. Um, and actually, so by focusing mainly on this kind of carving out spaces in the decision making process, or having a say in the decision making or policy making processes, so they focus mainly on the balance of power in society, or the democracy is not possible if it doesn't like lead to any kind of real distribution of power um, in a given society. Because like they mentioned, like, you know, this kind of socioeconomic power or privilege, class privilege, will be always there, and it cannot be eliminated. The only thing like democratic governance would do is kind of offer kind of counterbalanced relationship between different classes. So this is how they define democracy, and how they offered like a clear and specific definition or conception of democracy. So they don't actually offer like, or they didn't actually give a space for offering conceptual or developing like conceptual framework for capitalist development, but you can actually make a deduction from the three chapters. So they focus mainly on the implication of industrialization for social transformation. So they basically focus on the shift in the properties or the ownership, the mode of production, and how this would affect the social relations, and again the balance of power between different social forces and social groups, and how industrialization or modernization led to increasing level of urbanization, and offered some space for organizational or increased the organizational capacity, especially for working classes, because by building like extensive industrial bases, so they need like working class in order to work in the factories, for example. So they learned how to organize themselves. So the industrialization or modernization offered space for working class in order to organize itself in like trade unions or whatever. So that it offered more kind of organizational capacity to working class or to subordinate classes. And modernization as well, or industrialization, led to improvement in means of communication and transportation. So it added like one more layer to organizational density, or strengthen the civil society organizations, as they mentioned. So they focus mainly on the implication of industrialization and capitalist development for kind of radical or significant social transformation, and how this kind of conflicting interests or class interests that emanated or resulted from this transformation of economy or the mode of production offered some possibilities or opportunities for democracy by strengthening the subordinate classes and weakening mainly the landowners. So as I'm going to discuss like how they conducted the literature review, so they made it they managed to like to clarify how they actually built on more analysis, or more emphasis on agrarian class relations, and how the very existence of social classes or particular class that would feel like, you know, their interest, its own interest will be threatened by any kind of democratic rule, would resist or prevent the emergence of democratic governance. So the elimination or the transformation from feudalism to capitalism, it actually weakened the agrarian classes or the landowners, and it offered some space for cross-class alliances, as we're going to see how they build their own argument. So they depicted their own model as relative class power, model of democratization. So by focusing mainly on the balance of power, or the relative power relation between different classes, and how the conflict of the class interest and the kind of organizational capacity would open possibilities for democratization, which actually resulted from this capitalist development and contradictions of the inherent contradictions of industrialization and capitalist development. So here in slide 3, so they try to examine the relationship between capitalist development and democracy, and they went through like very like organized process in order to examine the relationship between the two concepts. So first they highlighted how it's kind of contested relationship between capitalism and democracy because of ideological confrontation, or different reactions from political theorists in the 18th century, and then empirical cases that complicated this relationship in the 20th century, and how like two main research traditions, quantitative and qualitative analysis, they offered like, they complicated this relationship between capitalism and democracy, and it became even more like, inconclusive. And then how they positioned themselves, and they offered kind of criticism to the existing literature. For the ideological confrontation, so it's mainly about like the West, East-West confrontation, and how democracy, like the liberal stand, like made connection between bourgeoisie class and democracy, while like Lenin and the leftist ideology mentioned like democracy, it's kind of proclaimed this rule of majority, and it offered some space for everyone or citizens who actually are eligible to vote in order to have a say in the decision-making process, but it actually protects the interest of the capitalist or the dominant classes. So it was placed under this kind of ideological debate between the East and the West, and then different streams in political theory actually complicated this relationship and made it even more highly contested, even between or amongst many liberal and bourgeoisie conservatives. So they actually highlight, as John Stuart Mill, for example, he offered kind of a vision of disaster, like democracy is kind of offered kind of false rule of the majority, and it actually kind of offered kind of tyranny of the majority, not like real power is really given to all citizens or to the public. At the left of the political spectrum lies Marx, for example. He mentioned like that the universal suffrage, for example, is a major step towards like transformation from a shift from the capitalist mode of production to establish socialism and the dictatorship of the proletariats. So it was like kind of a vision of hope to Marx, but it was not actually like democracy in the different. He offered actually different definition of democracy that had like kind of a different ideological content. Empirical cases actually in the 20th century complicated this relationship between democracy and capitalism, because some cases actually offered, they managed to sustain high level of development or capitalist development, and they were placed under the heading of authoritarian regime, most especially East Asia, like South Korea and Taiwan, and in Latin America, Chile and Brazil, for example. They were under harsh harshly repressive military regimes, and they managed to achieve high economic growth as well. Nazi Germany and fascist regimes as well during the interwar period, they managed to sustain high level of industrialization, while obviously the political regimes were not by any means democratic. And then they highlighted two methodological trends or two major research traditions: the quantitative cross-section analysis that examined, this kind of relationship or the correlation between development and democracy, and some studies that retreated from this comprehensive theoretical framework, and they focused mainly on particular case studies and perhaps like comparative historical studies. For the quantitative cross-sectional analysis, so the authors here, they accepted the results of modernization theory that actually linked high level of socioeconomic development and democracy, but they offered kind of different mechanisms, and they offered criticism to this functional relationship between modernization and democracy, and they needed to cast a light on or actually to look into the black box, the relation, to unravel, the causal forces or the causal dynamics between democracy and development. So because like modernization or industrialization doesn't carry its own explanation how this actually led to democracy. So this kind of functional or structural functional conception of social order, and this kind of linkage between well-functioning system of well-functioning economic, social, and systems, they are integrated by kind of values and culture, and they made it historically possible or easier to democracy in order to emerge as a functional kind of fit within this advanced capitalist economy. So they actually, for the authors, this functional and structural interpretation, they don't actually needs kind of more clarification or more explanation in order to highlight the causal forces that link between capitalist development or high level of social and economic development and democracy. And they highlighted some other like historical studies, comparative historical studies, that asserted or put an emphasis on the complex relationship or the sequence between capitalist development and democratic governance in order to trace the rise of the emergence of democracy within this favorable kind of the timing of the emergence of democracy was linked to timing of development, like favorable historical constellation of conditions that made it like in early stages of capitalist development that offered like more possibilities for democratic governance to emerge. And they tried to position themselves within these two trends or streams in the literature, and by highlighting this kind of contradictions or criticism, and what kind of contribution they would kind of offer, or what kind of gaps they would fill. So actually, in order to do this, they conducted like comprehensive literature review by focusing mainly on these two main traditions: quantitative cross national studies and qualitative or historical analysis of the relationship between development and democracy. This is what we are going to see in some detail now, because it's like we are trying to know how they build their argument, but this argument is not kind of a standalone thing. They had to go through like surveying the existing literature first, highlighting weaknesses or gaps, and what kind of contribution, what kind of questions they they actually asked from this critical literature review, and then how they built their argument accordingly. So here for the quantitative cross-national studies, so they agreed, as I mentioned, they agreed on the basic findings, but they offered different mechanisms, because they mentioned like this relationship, like the quantitative methods or the quantitative studies, they made like this correlation between democracy and development, but they didn't actually unravel the mechanisms or the causal, they didn't highlight the causal or explain the causal chains between development and democracy. So they started out by Leps, Leps by his emphasis on modernization and tolerance. So actually the study compared between European and Latin American studies in order to examine how social changes and different class interest or different class conflict offered some space for democratic governance or democratic rule to emerge. So he focused mainly on modernization and tolerance. So basically, he mentioned how industrialization led to increase in the level of wealth and communication and equality and per capita income. That these factors are pretty much associated with the education and the emergence of the middle class. So high level of modernization and the industrialization led to some sort of discrepancy in the distribution of wealth between the rich and the poor. And the rich, for example, they are they felt threatened by democracy because like their privileges or their advantages by allowing participation of the lower classes or the poor people in decision-making process will be undermined or threatened. And this kind of arrogant, as the study mentioned, like this arrogant attitudes for the part of the rich people, it did feed into this resentful feelings of the poor people. And the emergence of the middle class, as like it emanated, this kind of middle class was a product of the process of modernization and industrialization. It became the main kind of carrier of democracy or democratic ideas, because the middle class by nature, at the study, like assumed kind of moderate. So the middle class automatically the existence of the middle class, which is like by definition moderate, they would push for democratic governance. And then Cartwright, the study like offered or highlighted the interdependence between political institutions or the emergence of more complex and advanced political institution and high level of social and economic development. So the main idea here is how modernization or industrialization would lead to greater division of labor and structural differentiation in economy and society. And this kind of social differentiation or structural differentiation demanded more complex and specialized political institutions that actually paved the way for representative democracy or political representative institutions to emerge. And then they mentioned the study, how the Cartwright and Wiley actually tried to respond to some questions 6 years later when he published the first study on the relationship between social and economic development and democracy. And then this study in 1969, he and Wiley actually they focused on the conditions of regime change from representation over time. So they actually offered like pooled time series and cross-sectional analysis between 1927 1966 in order to the results or the positive correlation between the level of socioeconomic development and democracy, this kind of correlations hold over time. But the analysis turned to the changes in the political representation over time in order to answer what accounts for stability of regimes in the face of socioeconomic changes. So why some regimes manage to persist in the face of this social and economic changes, while others actually they didn't manage to survive. And they introduced actually one variable which was the provision of social security. They noticed, or the study actually, one of the main findings was like the change in the political representation was limited to countries that rated low in the provision of social security and high in literacy, high rate in literacy. So the actually the main point here is like this the new variable of social security provisions. It can be explained by two main ideas, like this kind of pressures or unmet like economic demands, or the failure in order to provide social security programs. This would trigger more kind of economic demands, and more pressures, led to more pressures for change and democratization. They hinted at another idea about the effectiveness of the government, because when the country, or when the government actually offered social security programs, it indicated like the effectiveness of the government in order it had like capable administrative structure and high capability in order to maintain the status quo, or actually it's really powerful to crush any kind of emerging opposition or emerging opponents, or to prive them into acquiescence. So actually, they introduced another variable, or a new variable, but still like some other questions needed to be answered. And then they shifted from this quantitative analysis with its focus on comprehensive and or kind of generalization results about the relationship between social and economic development and democracy. And they focus mainly on some other studies that represented a retreat from this comprehensive approach to the relationship between democracy and development, and some other comparative historical studies that addressed this kind of relationship between democracy and development. So Bolin, they made like the study actually highlighted the timing of development is very essential in order to understand this correlation, or the relationship, the positive relationship between levels of social and economic development and democracy. And according to this study, like democracy linked up or bound up with the historical conditions of early capitalist development. So the flip side of this argument is like the late development countries, they face kind of unfavorable conditions or position in the transnational division of labor in order to guarantee this high, to guarantee this kind of emergence of democratic governance. Actually, it's kind of contested relationship. The idea developed in like subsequent studies. But the main idea here, it's the timing. They have like some like the early capitalist advancement, they had like kind of privilege or favorable historical conditions that made it possible in order to make like this shift to democratic rule. While late development, latecomers actually they faced unfavorable conditions when they got integrated into the global market, and they became kind of dependent economically on the core or the more advanced countries. They didn't actually highlight the causal relationship, but perhaps because of this kind of rapid changes in late development countries led to high level of repression in order to quell or to crack down on high levels of mobilization. And then the studies introduced kind of new variable regarding the economic inequality. Whether or not economic inequality, what kind of association between economic inequality and democracy. And actually the no clear-cut kind of negative correlation, because when they introduced kind of other controls regarding like demographic variables or ethnic diversity or any other more controls, they actually affected this relationship. So it's not a kind of a conclusive negative correlation between income inequality. Some countries they would suffer from a high level of income inequality and they managed to sustain democratic rule, and other countries not. And then they focused on this core periphery relationship or correlation that linked actually or made the correlation between late development countries and authoritarianism. And these studies focused on other geopolitical factors like military intervention, or with the integration into global market, with the penetration of multinational corporations, for example, that affected the autonomy of the decision-making process, and how they needed the decision makers needed to resort to repressive measures in order to protect these kind of dominant interest or capitalist interests. And then one more study with Hanan and Carol, they introduced different variables in order to examine the relationship between, again, the levels of economic and social, or high levels of economic production and democracy. And the study actually introduced a different variable by focusing on ethnic diversity, and how ethnic diversity didn't actually only destabilize the political structure or the political form. They focus on mainly on the multi-party structure or multi-party political structure. So the ethnic diversity didn't only destabilize the political structure of multi-party systems, but it was actually negatively associated with democracy, because it facilitated this transition out of this multi-party polity or political structure into one party regime. Even like so here, like one more variable that kind of affected the relationship between levels of economic productivity or productions and democracy. So they need to introduce like another variable that would account for or complicate the relationship between the two variables. Yeah, and the most important like studies they focused on and they actually built on it was like the more study on the social origins of dictatorship and democracy. Actually more examined this relationship between democracy and development. He offered kind of comparative historical analysis and examined in some detail 3 possible trajectories, political trajectories. He examined like mainly 6 cases, like the US, England, France, China, Japan, and India, and extensive research on Germany and Russia. The prime focus was on the rural class structure, the agrarian structure, in order to examine like the three different political trajectories that emanated from the past historical conflict and institutional kind of structure regarding like different elements or different variables related to the strength of how centralized the state was, and the relative power of urban and rural dominant classes, the repressive agrarian structure or repressive labor, and the potential collective action of peasants in the rural areas. So, and he actually, according to this kind of past historical conflict and institutional structure of these elements, he examined like three main political trajectories of communist dictatorship and fascist dictatorship and parliamentary democracy. So the conditions under which parliamentary democracy or parliamentary democratic governance emerged. So for the communist revolution, with regard to the state, it was like highly centralized state, but the relative power of urban, rural dominant classes, it was like weak bourgeoisie class and repressive or agrarian structure. And the collective, the village actually offered kind of community networks and weak ties to landlords, in order that made it much more possible or easier for peasants in order to radicalize, you know, their behavior and to revolt against landowners. For fascist, you know, as another possible political trajectory, the state was strong, and he actually depicted this as a reactionary kind of evolution from above, because of the under, you know, these kind of historical conditions. The landowners or the landowning class was very kind of powerful, including the bourgeoisie. But both actually depended on the bourgeoisie depended on the state in order to support its own interests, by, for example, like, you know, for kind of protectionist measure. So the state actually controlled everything, and the state like offered kind of top-down favorable legislation and other kind of state-sponsored activities or industries. And for the rural or the agrarian structure was like still depended on repressive means, and the networks, in the rural areas, there was kind of no solidarity network, or there were no solidarity networks that made like any kind of revolutionary potential, very low for peasants. That was actually what Guillermo O'Donnell developed later. He actually extended more the results beyond the cases of Japan and Germany, in order to examine this fascist repression in Brazil and Argentina during the 60s and the 70s. So what he built on Moore's argument by elaborating more, or examining how this kind of tensions or internal contradictions of industrialization led to favorable conditions for the emergence of populist democracy, or kind of short-lived democratic experiment in Latin America that didn't, you know, this kind of democratic governance or democratic regime didn't offer, or didn't, you know, make some decisions acceptable to the dominant classes, which made like fascist repression as like, you know, or the final outcome, or the possible path in order to protect the interest of the dominant classes. And for more, the only possible like trajectory for parliamentary democracy was historically possible with the existence of independent kind of or autonomous middle class, fairly, there was kind of fairly or relative balance of power between the lords and the king, and the bourgeoisie class was strong in order to protect its own interest in the face of the dominant rural classes. So actually, for him, the bourgeoisie class actually made or managed to not only to protect its own interest or to tell the balance of power between the bourgeoisie and the king, but also managed to entice landowners into kind of commercial interest. So that's why they pushed for parliamentary democracy in order to protect their own interest, and hence was the notion of no bourgeoisie, no democracy. And actually, the current study, or the 3 chapters built on, extended actually the Moore's analysis by focusing on the balance of power between social classes, but they actually extended or reached beyond the bourgeoisie, because for them, for the authors, like, bourgeoisie might push for the installation of constitutional or parliamentary democracy, but they didn't actually support any kind of extension of the suffrage to the working class. So they resisted the idea or the policy in order to integrate or to include subordinate classes or the working class into the political process. And then Skocpol, actually, she was critical, as we are going to see when we examine some detail, his work on state and social revolutions. Actually, she focused mainly on the, besides or in addition to this social structure or class relations, she brought the state back into the analysis. So she focused mainly on the domestic power relations and international power relations, and how the state kind of mediated, or like the state actually did cut this across this relationship between different domestic and international power constellations, in order, like, the erosion of the administrative and coercive power of the state made any kind of revolutionary crisis possible, or facilitated the emergence of the revolutionary crisis. We're going to turn to her analysis in some detail, as I mentioned. So how actually they built their own argument. So after conducting this kind of literature review and defining precisely what they mean by democracy and the implication, not exactly capitalist development as a mode of production, but actually the implications of the industrialization for radical social and economic transformation. So they tried to introduce or to build their own argument, and to introduce their theoretical, or to develop their own theoretical framework. So it's mainly like, class power, democracy and class power. It's only possible when it actually led to significant distribution of power in class in society. So the class power and civil society mediated this relationship. So the causal dynamics here between capitalist development and democracy is clear by bringing or plugging in the class power and the density, organizational capacity or organizational density of civil society, and how they define civil society organizations. So they refer to all social institutions or associations, formal or informal, that, as they mentioned, quote unquote, they are not strictly production related or governmental in nature. So actually, the under this subheading, they put all formal and informal organizations and associations, especially for subordinate classes. So how they elaborated on this intervening variable between democracy and capitalist development and democracy, how capitalist development historically led to democracy. So central to the main argument or the causal forces, class interest or class conflict, and for them, contrary to More, with the prime focus on the bourgeois, they focused on the subordinate classes and how they resisted the dominant interest or the dominant classes in order to push for or to push for to push for or to establish democratic regime. So basically, they focus on the class, power, and social structure, with the dynamics between, or the interrelation or the interconnectedness between the three clusters of power. The first one is like the power, the balance of power and social structure between different classes, and how this kind of power relations or the balance of power determined the emergence and the stability and even the sustainability of democracy. So the existence of like More, the existence of social class, which was like very hard to get placated or appeased, that all the way through would oppose democracy, it would be very difficult to establish democratic regime. So by changing, this balance of power or the emergence of new class forces that would pressure or change the class relations or the power relations with the dominant class, by organizing itself or increasing its own organizational capacity, like formation or establishing trade unions or political parties, and the forging kind of cross-class alliance with urban middle class if they feel like their own interests are not gonna get kind of threatened, are not gonna be threatened by democracy. So they might kind of find like common goal with the working class parties or working class in order to push for democracy. So the key to understand, here the balance of power notion, it's kind of the class interest and the organizational density, and how this would affect possibilities of firstly constituting a kind of collective actor with kind of resources in order to organize themselves and to act collectively, and then to push for democratization. And then this kind of power or the balance of power complemented by two more kind of power configurations. The first one related to the structure or the autonomy of the state and its interrelations with the civil society or with civil society organizations, and the impact of transnational power relations, and how actually this kind of transnational power relations affected the balance of power, the domestic balance of power between different social forces or different social classes. For the state autonomy, so for them, they actually didn't make any argument regarding this kind of social or institutional differentiation. They focused mainly on the state as an apparatus of implementing policies and enforcing laws. So it's an arena of making binding collective decisions on all social actors or social forces. So it had like the partial autonomy of the state from dominant classes is very like is one kind of important component of the argument building here. So because of like Marxist analysis, they would maintain like that traditionally, like they absorbed the state into society. So the state for them was only, for the majority of them, a tool in the hands of the dominant class in order to protect their own interest. Here the argument is the state has its own autonomous, existence or apparatus on its own right, and it's kind of is although it might get affected by capital owners or managers, but it retains kind of degree of autonomy from society. Is not totally absorbed into civil society organizations. So sometimes the state, the most important thing is to maintain or to their financial capacity by extracting or collecting taxes, and to strengthen or to keep the military advantage, or to maintain its military power. So sometimes if the state faces any kind of pressures from subordinate classes, so it has to offer some concessions in order to keep, or to in order to to guarantee its to make sure it can proceed with its main functions, which are mainly maintaining order and maintaining or increasing actually financial capacity. So actually the one important component here is state autonomy. The first component is the balance of power between social classes, and then complemented by state autonomy and transnational power relations. For example, external intervention, or the dependency on external power, it would impose kind of changes, the intervention of the US and the Japan, and how actually it imposed kind of political and constitutional changes after the Second World War. And here we can actually bring this dependent capitalist development, and how this actually affected negatively the late development countries by precluding the two effects of favorable capitalist transformation. Actually delayed this kind of radical social transformation in society, and reshaping the class structure or the social structures, and by actually increasing or strengthening the bonds between domestic interest and international capitalist. They actually prevented the emergence of pro-democracy forces, or they made it possible for the state in order to quell or to crack down on any emerging democratic forces. And then the transnational power relations, we can bring another factor regarding the diffusion of ideas as well. For example, fascist ideas affected negatively any possibility of the emergence of democratic regime in the interwar period, because of the prevalence of these fascist ideas, and how it attracted wide mass support in some countries. So for them, they specified the relationship between they specified the concept, they defined the concept, and then they conducted the literature review, and then how they established this relationship between capital's development and democracy by highlighting three main causal forces, that they are pretty much related to class forces, or class interest, or class power. So the balanced power of classes, and how this actually increased the power of subordinate classes and undermined or weakened the power of the landowners. And then how the state autonomy and its interrelations with with civil society organizations. And the third element is the transnational power relations, and to what extent it might have kind of domestic ramifications with regard to the class structure and transformation of balanced power between social classes. So the authors as well try to highlight to what extent their contribution is different from the liberal traditions and Marxist-Leninist traditions as well. So they repeatedly emphasized, they didn't attribute any kind of democratic role to the bourgeoisie class, and they focused mainly on the internal tensions or internal contradictions of the capitalist developments that unwittingly led to different or radical social or significant social transformation, or the change in the balance of power between different social forces, and offered some space for subordinate classes in order to organize themselves and to constitute kind of collective actor to push for democracy. So the subordinate classes, and most especially the working class, had a very central position in the analysis. So the question, and they didn't make like, so they didn't like highlight any or they didn't offer any credit to the bourgeoisie class as more did, because they might, they exclude the working class from any kind of democratic framework. And they didn't actually, as well, they didn't highlight any prepossessions, or they didn't buy into any prepossessions about social and structural differentiations. So it's only, again, the contradictions of the capitalist development. So it's different from the studies that focus on the complexity of the institutional configuration that actually emanated from this social and structural differentiation that in their turn actually emanated or resulted from industrialization and modernization. So for them, it's only the internal contradictions of capitalist development that led to the change of the balance of power, or the change in the constellations or the configurations of the of the power relations. The power relations between different classes on the one hand, and between state and these kind of social forces on the other hand, and then how, like, the international power relations as well, and the state position in the international arena actually fed into this kind of democratization pressures, or shifted the balance of power between different social forces domestically. So the question here: should we assume, or should we agree that, like, this kind of pro-democracy position of the working class? If so, how can we interpret, like, how can we analyze, or how can we position, like, the vanguard parties or the Leninist, parties and other working class parties in this framework? So actually, the authors themselves, they expected, this kind of criticism. So that's why they mentioned, like, sometimes when the working class, it's kind of conditional stand, like they might have this pro-democracy stand, but actually in cases that you were not mobilized by charismatic authoritarian leaders, or kind of hegemonic political party that was linked to the state apparatus. So again, like, when they mentioned something about the prospects for cross-class alliance as well, nothing was conclusive again regarding the support of the middle class, or the acceptance of the middle class in order to enter any kind of, to establish any kind of alliance with the working class. So it depended on whether or not, they perceived, their own interest would be affected negatively or positively by the establishing or the installation of democratic regime. So, and finally, how they actually vindicated, or they justified their reliance on the comparative historical analysis, despite, the existence, or the existence of some methodological caveats or criticism. So actually, they still like they departed from the findings of the quantitative studies or the quantitative analysis about the positive correlation between levels of social and economic development and um, and democracy. But again, it's kind of a correlation that doesn't actually inform us about the causation or the causal dynamics. Um, so for them, it's kind of these studies like suggested, kind of offered some um, findings that needed further analysis. For example, this kind of negative association or negative effect of state strength and or centralization of power and democracy. So it needed more kind of elaboration why this highly centralized power had negative effect on democratic possibility, and then the negative effect of ethnic fragmentation and democracy as well, and then positive relation between cultural factors and democracy. Like for example, like some of the studies they surveyed, they made correlation between the existence or the proportion of Protestants and democracy, and the British colonial power and democracy. So how can we interpret, how can we explain the causal dynamics between the two variables, and the correlation or the association between social security provision and stability of political form or political structure of multi-party system, or the transformation from multi-party system to single party system. Why this kind of social security provision affected stability or change of representative political forms over time in some countries, while in others, obviously, there was kind of variation. Um, the quantitative analysis couldn't explain or couldn't offer plausible explanation for this. And they made it like as we mentioned in last week actually, or the last lecture, when we made a distinction between inductive and deductive modes. So here they focused on the comparative historic analysis, and they highlighted their analytic induction that would inform or offered or increased the explanatory power of the research design by elaborating more on the processes and the causal unraveling the causal forces. One of the methodological issue here is kind of what's called degrees of freedom. When you have like too many variables, so it's not only like capitalist development, we might have so many other like variables regarding state strength, military intervention, different other variables, and we have like few cases. So we mentioned like we have to take this into consideration. We're going to talk about this in week 10 when we examine in some detail criteria against which or the criteria we need to abide by, or the criteria that would offer some guidance for case selections. And we're gonna go back to the case selection thing, to go back to these studies in order to examine how authors actually selected the cases in order to build the argument and to develop their own theoretical framework. I will actually have some questions for you, and we are gonna have like we're gonna have discussions on online forum on Moodle, for example, in order to answer these questions. Um, what should you do here is like I assume like you should have read actually the chapters. So now like after going through the argument and the literature review and the theoretical framework, what kind of criticism or what kind of questions still like you have in your mind, and still kind of some other issues that are not addressed here and you need like which these kind of issues that need further examination. So you can like think about other questions. This study doesn't actually offer answers to the questions you have in mind, and perhaps some criticism. You can offer some criticism to this structural analysis, and more on case selections and kind of other kind of methodological issues when we are going to study in some detail case selections in week 10 and process tracing in week 10. So I'll go through like the other two studies, and then I can like elaborate more on the final or the last slide here, where I put some questions or exercises for you in order to work on. Okay, now we turn to Scott Pease chapter, actually from States and Social Revolutions. So here we're trying to know how to, or to see how she actually developed the conceptual framework, how she defined state and social revolutions, and made distinction between social revolutions and other similar concepts. So she basically defined social revolutions as rapid transformations of state structure and class structure, and these rapid transformation or radical transformations carry through pressures from below and basically a class upheaval from below. So she focused mainly on two mutually reinforcing processes of social structural change and political transformation. So social revolutions for her like include two main processes, like transformation, like the transformation of the class and social structure on the one hand, and the political structure on the other hand. And she differentiated between social revolutions and political revolutions and rebellions. For her, rebellions entail kind of share some basic element of like revolt of subordinate classes. It entailed kind of, or usually entail like class upheaval as well and pressures from below. But rebellions don't lead to structural a change like social revolutions, that by definition successful ones that brought about different societal structural change and political transformation. And she mentioned something about like political revolutions, that as well these revolutions share or have something in common with social revolutions, which is the transformation of state structures. But political revolutions don't actually include any kind of change in the social and social structures and class conflict. For the state and how actually she defined the state, she adopted kind of non-Marxist stand, because she actually defined the state by referring to the administrative capacity and the coercive organizations. So not as an arena for class conflict or interest conflict of interest between different classes. So the state had kind of partial autonomy from socioeconomic structures. So and she defined the state by referring to the main functions, basically three main ones: maintaining security and order, collecting taxes, and maintaining kind of military recruits. So actually, this is how she differentiated. She defined social revolutions and differentiated between revolutions, social revolutions, political revolutions, and rebellions, and how she actually defined state and referred to the partial autonomy from the class and the socioeconomic structure. So how she actually established this kind of connection or relationship between state and social revolutions. That was part of her effort in argument building, as we're going to see. But before that, she tried to as well, to conduct kind of literature review in order to position her study and in order to highlight the main contribution of her comparative historical analysis of state and social revolutions. She actually referred to three main theories or traditions that investigate the roots of social instability and political violence. Like, these studies actually study revolution as, in a sense, that it's revolution is kind of a manifestation of social instability and political violence. So some theorists try to examine or to look into the causes or the forces that actually give rise to political violence and social instability. She focused on three main theoretical traditions: aggregate psychological ones, and macro sociological ones, and political conflict theories. And she tried to offer kind of critical analysis, to the main premises of these theories. And she tried to offer what kind of contribution her theoretical framework or her analysis would add to these theories. So for her, the aggregate psychological theories, like Gur in his piece Why Men Rebel, the main focus on the psychological motives of engaging in political violence activities. So why actually men engaged in violence or political violence, and why Men Rebel developed this theory of relative deprivation theory. So meaning people would engage in violence or violent activities when they feel they actually get less than what they see or what they see that they are entitled to. So when they actually believe they deserve more, so actually they might they feel way too dissatisfied with the status quo, so that's why they resort to violence in order to express kind of discontent and dissatisfaction with their situation. But again, she actually, the critique she offered here, the mechanisms, is the kind of the process of the transformation of this social discontent into actual violent action. This relation is not the dynamics and the relations are not clear. So what accounts for this transformation? People might be dissatisfied or feeling dissatisfied with the current situation, and they feel like they are entitled to more rights, but they didn't actually, this didn't or historically didn't automatically lead to the transformation of their discontent or plight into actual violent action. So that's why political conflict theories, they highlighted or asserted or emphasized this role of organizations in order to offer more resources or organizational capacity in order to transform this discontent into actual political action. So for political conflict theories, she referred to Tilley's book From Mobilization to Revolution. And revolution here was kind of a special case of collective action. So he actually tried to investigate the dynamics of collective action. And revolution was kind of a special case of different forms of collective action, starting from demonstrations and riots, whatever, or strikes, and then social mobilization, and then the kind of the ultimate manifestation of this collective action or contentious behavior was the revolution. So actually, when contenders they fight for ultimate political sovereignty over the population in order to have control over resources and coercive apparatuses. So that's why they might kind of carry out a revolution in order to advance their own program, in order to establish their control over government. So it's kind of a prolonged situation of struggle or creating multiple sovereignty that eventually lead to the displacement of existing power holders and establishing different political regime with revolutionary ideology and wide mass support. But for Skocpol, like, both theories actually neglected the structural transformation. So they focus mainly on the like psychological motives and like what kind of resources that enabled constitution of collective action in order to take over power without paying or actually abstracting away from this structural transformation thing. And then she mentioned something about this macro psychological account or theory of system and value consensus theories as elaborated by Johnson's revolutionary change. For this sociological account, revolution is not a special event or a special type of political event like political violence or collective action. So it's actually part of like they adopted this macro psychological approach to societal integration and structural change. For them, like a social system, a functioning social system, quote unquote, it's kind of a consistent set of institutions that express and specify core societal value orientations in norms and roles. So it in turn like legitimize or delegitimize authority. So it's kind of functioning social system that include different institutions with different kind of value and orientations and different roles and norms. When like revolutionary crisis or when like existing this kind of functioning social system comes into crisis, what happens actually was kind of disorientation or disjuncture between these kind of existing environment and value, the value orientation and the norms and the roles. So it's kind of social revolutions will be needed in order to resynchronize, the social system's values and environment, in order to bring values and environment together again. So violence might be used as a tool or like purposive strategy in order to change the social structure. So like value reorientation here, and like bringing again, like, together, blending or bringing together the environment and the social system's values and norms is essential to revolutionary social change and re-establishing political legitimacy. But like for her, like as we're gonna see, like these kind of social revolutions, and it's the social revolution is more than reorientation or resynchronization between values and social systems values and social systems values and environment, because like for her, like your revolutionary crisis just like emerges more than, it's not like deliberately made by actors. So that's why she made it very clear in the beginning that she actually embraced this macro structural or Marxist analysis in order to explain social revolutions in the cases she selected. So she examined like the macro structural and historical context and based her analysis on Marxist theory of mode of production and class relations of property ownership and surplus appropriation. So for her, like, this kind of macro structural and historical change happened with the disjuncture between the mode of production and class relations. So this kind of disjuncture intensified class conflict and led to kind of self-consciousness for class action in order to carry out a revolution. So, but she actually complemented this structural or Marxist analysis with the political conflict perspective, because she needed to examine like how this class conflict developed in the course of the revolution or during the revolutionary path, and the conditions and the timing when these class members effectively decided to organize themselves and to fight for their interests. So it's more like, more than like self-consciousness in order to, that cannot be translated automatically into particular action. So it's kind of how and when class members effectively organize themselves in order to advance or to fight for their interests, and how this intensification of class conflict developed during the course of during the revolutionary course. So departing from the idea that revolutionary crisis emerged and it's not like deliberately made, she actually emphasized, or she did cast light on three main assertions. This kind of structural perspective in order to focus on the causes and processes from non-voluntarist point of view, and then the international structure and the world historical development. So it's not only like, this kind of domestic dynamics of class and social transformation or class structure. So the positionality of the state within the international structure, and the state itself, what will happen to its coercive and administrative apparatuses. So like these kind of three main pillars she established in order to examine the relationship between the state and social revolution. So actually she reached beyond this kind of structural and social transformation, and she offered kind of criticism to more as well, in order to focus on the international structure and world historical development, and the state itself, what actually caused the collapse of its coercive and administrative organizations. So for the structural perspective, she had kind of an issue or a problem with this generic model of social revolutions, like this kind of the path from like social system changes or crises, and then how this would trigger kind of wide grievances and dislocation of the especially subordinate from powerless or subordinate classes, and this will develop like, automatically like new class or group interest, and this would carry a potential for collective action or collective mobilization. So mass-based movement would overthrow the dominant class and establish its own authority and government. But the question is like, under what conditions or what kind of causal conditions, the necessary causal condition that led to like, this kind of eruption of mass-based movement and establishing different kind of authority. For her, like, something like that never happened unless like it accompanied by diminishing or erosion of the coercive and administrative structure of the state in order to establish another authority, or to dismantle actually the old regime, or to discredit and to overthrow like the dominant class. The new social forces they needed to occupy, these kind of administrative structure and coercive organizations. So they had to sever their control over and to assume the functions of the state. So this kind of element or pillar is complemented by two more pillars or elements, international one and the state one. So the international structure and world historical development, she actually shifted the focus away from domestic and modernization factors, like how modernization would led to actually like advancement of transportation and communication in order to bring different forces together and to create their own organizations and spaces in order to pressure or to organize, revolutionary action that would overthrow the existing incumbent government or the existing government in order to establish their own one and advance their own program. So she just shifted away from this exclusive focus on domestic elements or domestic factors on modernization, basically like the repercussions of modernization for social transformations. And she mentioned like capitalism and military competition are very kind of the relationship between there is a link between capitalism and military competition. It's kind of intertwined relationship. So the military kind of relevant strength of the state and the international advantage of the state are very crucial in order to determine the international economic position of the state that actually might accelerate the process of revolutionary crisis. So this kind of unequal competition or competitive transnational interactions might lead to like this like military defeat or this kind of unequal or uneven relationship between domestic and international forces because of like they compete over whatever like market or different like properties. This might lead to like emergence of revolutionary crisis, some domestic forces or emerging revolutionary forces would capitalize on in order to advance their own program and to dismantle the old regime institutions. Yeah, and that's why she came to the third one, how like the state actually and its administrative and coercive apparatuses mediated this power constellations of the social structure and the international structure, because actually if it's kind of axiomatic if we mention like no regime would actually survive any kind of mass mobilizations or masses that were widely kind of consciously disgruntled. So but nothing would make real social revolutions possible or successful social revolutions without dismantling these kind of organizations, administrative and coercive organizations. If the state is powerful enough, so the state might crack down or smash actually the revolutionary forces by its military capabilities and its administrative efficiency. So the erosion of these military capabilities and administrative efficiency are important in order to speak of any kind of successful social revolution or successful investment or capitalization on a revolutionary crisis. So these kind of contradictions, of the state of old regime and vanguard, parties' goal of establishing centralized army and administrations. So again, like they might have like their parallel regime. They might have their own, like the revolutionary forces or vanguard parties. They had like their own centralized military or army, and their own kind of administrations in order to take over power centers. So any kind of class upheaval from below intertwined actually with the collapse of the state organizations. So the three elements or the three dimensions actually the mutually complement each other's. So it's not it's like the class structure or the social structure, international structure, and the state, apparatuses as well. I mean, we can go into like the third reading, the chapter by Wickham Crowley, and then I'll ask you to make a comparison between like Skocpol and on state and social revolutions, and Timothy or Wickham Crowley chapter on guerrilla movements and successful, guerrilla movements in Latin America. What accounts for their success and failure, and to what extent, they have kind of similarities or commonalities of the analysis, and to what extent they differed from each other. So now we turn to Crowley in Winners Losers piece on comparative sociology of Latin American guerrilla movements. So actually, the chapter didn't like offer space for like this kind of conceptual development. So it didn't really offer kind of conceptual framework, but you can like by reading the chapter, you can come up with what kind of concepts the chapter tried to elaborate on. So basically, he examined the origins and the context of the guerrilla movements in Latin America. So he focused mainly on the symbolic and ideological revolutionary ideas, and how like the socialist revolution in Cuba like had significant impact or demonstration effect across Latin America, and actually inspired other movements or paramilitary movements in order to undertake their own revolutionary act. Um, and he actually, so he focused on the symbolic and ideological elements of these movements, and how like the Cuban the revolution in Cuba like kind of set the standards for them. And he made a distinction between these kind of revolutionary movements in the 60s, and the others emerged in the 70s or in the 80s. So in the 60s, actually, they were inspired by Cuban revolution, and it was like kind of a reaction. These revolutionary actions was kind of a reaction to the reimposition of non or counter-revolutionary government during the 60s. And later, it was like, the emergence of guerrilla movements was kind of a reaction to the persistence of the old regimes. And he actually emphasized old regimes in a sense like they were kind of very closed political system, and they offered actually roughly no space for political participation. And this kind of old regimes actually, the persistence of the old regime actually offered space or incentives to disaffected intellectuals or marginalized political elites in order to articulate their revolutionary or instill their revolutionary ideas in their societies, basically in Colombia, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. So he firstly investigated these kind of conditions under which, or the conditions that actually affected the variation of the varied, as he mentioned, fortunes of guerrilla-based revolutions. So why some movements manage to successfully to seize power. This is like the main criterion of successful guerrilla movement, how to seize power, and the others actually didn't manage to seize power. Um, and he claimed that the chapter tried to fill a gap in the literature, because the literature tried to tackle or to address these kind of guerrilla movements in a journalistic and non-comparative manner. So that's why he tried to offer kind of comparative sociological approach to investigate the variation of success and failure of these movements. And he made a distinction between two time periods, like in the 60s, right after the Castro's revolution in Cuba, and how like the 26th movement actually managed to overthrow Batista, and later in the 70s the successful case of Nicaragua, when Sandinista put an end to Somoza, put an end to the rule of the Somoza family dynasty in Nicaragua. And then he actually tried to examine why guerrilla movements in Guatemala and El Salvador and Colombia and to some extent Venezuela didn't manage to reach to arrive at this level of reaching or seizing power. And then like two cases that represent actually the failure of the guerrilla movements in Bolivia and Peru. So now how he actually established this kind of causal forces. um, he focused mainly on the three main social preconditions for the expansion and success of guerrilla movements in seizing power. So in order to reach power or to discredit the incumbent government and to establish their own political authority, these movements needed to get kind of social penetration or expansion and some kind of support from the wide masses. So he focused mainly on the support from peasants and like the military strength of these movements, and how the third factor or the third precondition was kind of mass loyalty, how these movements managed to shift the mass loyalty in order to discredit or to strip the incumbent government of of its legitimacy, or the old elites of their legitimate position, in order to establish their own political authority and their own legitimate position. So for him, the peasant support, he focused mainly on this kind of alliance between intellectual leaders and peasant rank and file. And for him, it was like this kind of alliance between between the two forces. It was kind of a necessary but not sufficient condition, by highlighting these kind of alliance between intellectuals and peasants happened in Bolivia and Peru, but actually it didn't take them farther during the 60s. So in order to understand or to establish variation in peasant support, he actually mentioned it's not only the support, but it's perhaps the quality and the kind or the proportion of the support. So to what extent the peasants were willing to offer kind of supply information, food, or they might be, or they were willing to act as guide or occasional militia, to undertake kind of occasional militia duty, or to get incorporated into full time, as to be incorporated into their kind of guerrilla armed force, army, as a full time combatant. So it's kind of the sustainability and the reality of the sustainability of the support and the reality of peasants are kind of essential in order to offer support to guerrilla movements to sustain its insurrectional activity or violent actions. And like these kind of variations in support are the variations are pretty much linked to the conditions that contribute to this variation. So he focused mainly on four factors like agrarian structure, dislocation, rebellious culture, and access to peasant resources. Um, so these actually four factors would determine the sustainability and the quality of the support. So for him, the structure, the agrarian structure, so some kind of structure triggered this zero-sum conflict between peasants and landowners. So in this kind of agrarian structure, peasants were more willing to support guerrilla activities in order to dismantle the existing power structures, like sharecroppers and migratory estate labor or land squatting. These kind of a structure, they didn't have peasants didn't have something to lose, so that's why they were willing, to. It's kind of either peasants or landowners, so that's why they were willing to support guerrilla movements in order to change the existing system. So, for example, in Colombia, the expansion of the change of the agricultural structure towards coffee, it created kind of more colonization or more displacement of peasants. So that's why they were inclined to join militia actions or to get incorporated into paramilitary organizations. And Sandinista, for example, like in Nicaragua, this kind of shift in cattle ranching, in Nicaragua, it offered kind of permissive or more conducive environment or structure for peasants to join, Sandinista movement. Dislocation as well. So through legal or extra legal assaults on landed security of cultivators. So if the state allowed, through legal channels or extra, legal channels to that actually threatened, this landed security of cultivators, this would lead to displacement and dislocation. So that's why it offered kind of recruitable peasants for guerrilla movements in order to support their action against the old regime. And they might have, this kind of, because of this relationship with the alliance with the intellectual leaders, so they have kind of rebellious culture as well. So they might have their ideological framework or ideational force in order to sustain their violent actions. And availability of resources as well, like availability of political parties that they might forge an alliance with peasants in order to sustain or to offer kind of sustainability to their action. And sometimes they gained the Catholic Church support, especially from progressive wing or liberation theology wing in the Catholic Church that offered more legitimacy to their action. Yeah, and needless to say, in order to sustain paramilitary action or insurgency action, So the guerrilla movements, they needed kind of level of military strength in order to maintain their internal solidarity and to sustain, kind of funding or financing, their activities, and to fend off, other, like, financial effort for counter insurgency actions, like especially from the United States, that supported, some counter insurgency groups in order to quell or to put an end to left wingers or guerrilla movements in Latin America. So the internal strength, actually, or the internal solidarity and the military strength, in some cases, especially like, in Nicaragua, they managed to mitigate, any kind of external financial support or military aid. But actually, it led to like severe and brutal civil wars in El Salvador and Guatemala as well. So military strength is another, like, important component or important precondition. And then in order to establish their own political authority or to have their own, government, they need to get, like, the mass loyalty, to shift the mass loyalty away from the incumbent or the existing government in order to establish their own one. So they might do that through, or historically, actually, in successful cases, they did that through, like, establishing a cross-class and multi-institutional support. So in order to do that, like, guerrilla movements try to change the discourse or the rhetoric in order to attract more adherents, like, or potential adherents and more supporters. So in order to win the progressive wing in the Catholic Church, to their side, so they downplayed, this Marxist element or Marxist rhetoric in order to get the support of the advocates of liberation theology in the Catholic Church. And actually, in Cuba and Nicaragua, like, the movements, they had, like, their media, the access to media, or their kind of media outlet in order to disseminate, their own revolutionary ideals, like La Prensa and Bohemia, for the case of, like, Cuba and Nicaragua, Sandinista in Nicaragua. So in the other cases that they failed, to seize power, they didn't manage to shift the mass reality because of the, like, the ploy of the government, that the government actually intervened by offering some electoral and reform programs, like land reform programs, in order to offer, lands for peasants. So that's why they undermined, the government actually undermined, the support base for guerrilla movements in the rural areas. And it offered, kind of elections in order to expose, different image of in order to bring in, some sort of political legitimacy to the established authority. So actually, they didn't manage to shift any kind, to get, like, more mass support in order to deprive, the current or the existing ruling elite of any kind of mass support. Or the government, by doing that, like by offering some electoral and agricultural or land reform programs, it actually fragmented, any kind of alliance built between guerrilla movements or the leaders and peasants. So actually, and in some cases, especially in the cases that the countries descended into brutal civil wars, the government or the political establishment actually distorted the image of the guerrilla movements by not only by retaining, legitimacy, but actually depicting, the guerrilla leaders as terrorists, because they placed blame on these movements for kind of terrorist actions and high, casualties, especially amongst civilians. So that's why they didn't manage to discredit, the current or the existing power power structure, or to strip incumbents of legitimacy and to replace, to replace it with their own government as a legitimate one. So according to the chapter, by in offering some details on some movements, some guerrilla movements in different countries in Latin America, and highlighting successful cases. For him, revolutionary, like any kind of political act, it's kind of art of what's possible. It's kind of a possibility, and this kind of revolutionary possibility kind of can be circumvented by any kind of political social cause or political maneuvering of different regimes. So this is how like the three pieces try to build like a compelling argument and to establish kind of a relationship between two concepts, and to offer, as we mentioned, causal mechanisms that would link the independent and dependent variable. So you have after these 2 weeks, I cannot it's still a seminar, so I don't know how I'm gonna run this online. So the only possible way for us is to kind of to have online forum on Moodle. It would be like part of your participation, so it's graded. So we can have open to kick off kind of discussion regarding these readings. So you have after these 2 weeks, I post on Moodle some questions, but you need to think about any kind of criticism or points of weakness, like these studies in the 3 studies actually they actually overlooked, and you need to this would trigger more thoughts or bring some questions to your mind, and you need to investigate more. And from this criticism and highlighting these kind of points of weakness in the 3 studies, so you can formulate your puzzling or research questions in light of the critique you will offer. And then the last thing, I leave it for you to think about. It's kind of the similarities and differences between Skocpol and Wickham-Crowley analyses. They both kind of adopted a structural, approach to kind of social revolutions, and they highlighted, the emergence of this kind of revolutionary crisis, and they have different perspectives on preconditions and historical development of these kind of structural analysis. But you can think through these kind of 2 different analytical framework with different application to different countries. But we are going to leave the selection of the countries to the case study weeks. But now you need to think about these similarities and differences between Skocpol and Crowley analysis with regard to social revolutions. What kind of to what extent they highlighted the advanced kind of conceptual framework in order to investigate social revolutions, how they defined these kind of social revolutions, how they explained the emergence of this revolutionary crisis, what kind of factors they both neglected or they put an emphasis on, and what kind of criticism you might offer to these 2 studies. And obviously all like the 3 studies, they actually adopted or embraced this kind of structural analysis to to social revolutions or successful like guerrilla movements in the case of Skocpol and Crowley, and the structural analysis of the relationship between capitalist development and establishment of democratic regime in the case of Huber and Steffen's book, or the 3 chapters we investigated. As I mentioned, we will get back to like the same studies, like the 3 studies again, to highlight case selections and process tracing. Like this will be in week 10. And as agreed, in the lecture, as it was agreed, actually, I should have addressed or highlighted or explained in some detail the systemic vulnerability article. And you should have elaborated or presented, the 3 pieces I did, in this lecture. So it's kind of the opposite way around now. I did the 3 pieces, and you will do the article on systemic vulnerabilities and the emergence of the developmental state. So this will be the subject of your review, which is due in week 9, as it's listed in your syllabus. You should follow the same steps. So what's developmental state, how the authors actually define this, and what kind of analysis, how they build their arguments, and what kind of critical review they offered to the existing literature in order to bring about kind of different variable or different concept in order to analyze the emergence of the developmental state. But this will be actually after the 2 weeks I'll post some more instructions, but you need to think through the exercise here, the 3 questions I offered, and then we can go in some detail or to go into an argument on online forum on Moodle. Okay, I leave it there, and I'm looking forward to receiving your questions and to have more kind of online interaction. Yeah, bye.